What happened when the enslaved black women became pregnant with either the child of their white master or black breeder? Logic says that because the child which will be born will be sold and will bring profit, the enslaved black woman should have gotten rest during pregnancy. However, the reality was far from this. Instead of allowing the black women slaves to rest and take care of themselves, they were made to work on plantations all day. Not only that, but immediately after they gave birth, they were called back on plantations to do the hard work. Yet, that's not it, because often, the black women slaves would become the source of lust for their white masters. Because the white masters knew black women were pregnant and would not be pregnant again, if sexual activities were done with them during pregnancy, this would result in the worst form of exploitation. So what horrific was done with the enslaved black women during pregnancy that they don't tell you about? Welcome to a new episode of Black Afric Diary, a channel where we talk about Black African history, culture, arts, and civilization. It's a place where you will see the real picture of Black Africa, its stories, and the events defining it. In this episode, we will tell you about the untold and less listened accounts of enslaved black women's treatment during pregnancy. Let's get started. Enslaved black women faced the unbearable burden of pregnancy within the confines of slavery, often enduring two horrific scenarios: sexual exploitation by their white masters and systematic breeding on slave farms. These barbaric practices were not merely isolated acts of cruelty. They were driven by the economic interests of slaveholders seeking to bolster their labor force during the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. In the brutal reality of slavery, sexual exploitation by white masters was a grim fate endured by many enslaved women. Subjected to relentless abuse and exploitation, these enslaved black women were seen as mere objects for their owners' satisfaction. With little hope for justice, resistance often led to severe punishment or death, leaving them trapped in a cycle of vulnerability and exploitation. Furthermore, reproduction served as a tool for control by slaveholders, who exploited enslaved black women's bodies to expand their workforce without incurring additional expenses. Forced to bear children destined to be owned by their masters, enslaved women faced the constant threat of family separation, perpetuating the cycle of bondage and exploitation for future generations. The horrors of deliberate breeding were equally repugnant, with some slaveholders establishing breeding farms or breeding pens to systematically pair enslaved women with men for profit-driven reproduction. Treated as nothing more than breeding stock, these women endured coercion and forced sexual relationships to produce offspring destined for a life of enslavement. Motivated by economic gain, slaveholders sought to capitalize on the demand for domestically born slaves post-abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. By controlling the reproduction of black slaves, they aimed to create a self-sustaining workforce, perpetuating the institution of slavery through natural increase rather than relying solely on imported slaves from Africa. Pregnant enslaved women endured immense physical and emotional strain, often forced to work in harsh conditions until the very moment they gave birth. Despite the well-known risks of pregnancy, slaveholders prioritized their own financial gain over the well-being of these women and their unborn children. Working alongside their fellow slaves in the fields, pregnant women faced grueling tasks for extended hours, enduring intense heat or adverse weather conditions. They were assigned demanding work such as hoeing, planting, and harvesting crops, tasks that required significant physical exertion and placed immense stress on their bodies. Additionally, pregnant women were frequently assigned tasks involving heavy lifting or carrying burdensome loads, further straining their already taxed bodies. Whether it was hauling water buckets, moving heavy objects, or caring for livestock, these women were compelled to engage in activities that jeopardized their health and the health of their unborn children. The expectation for pregnant enslaved women to continue working until giving birth was driven by slaveholders' relentless pursuit of profit and productivity. Any concern for the well-being of these women was dismissed in favor of extracting maximum labor from their enslaved workforce, regardless of the toll it took on human life and dignity. In the unforgiving reality of antebellum America, pregnant enslaved women confronted a world of profound neglect and scarcity. Their lives were molded by a system that prioritized profit over empathy, where basic medical care and proper nutrition were unattainable luxuries. Medical care for pregnant enslaved women was shockingly inadequate, laying bare the inherent cruelty of slavery. Unlike their white counterparts, who had access to trained healthcare professionals, enslaved women received minimal to no medical help during pregnancy and childbirth. Instead, they relied on older enslaved women within their communities, known as grannies or aunties, for whatever assistance they could offer with limited resources. These grannies lacked formal medical training, depending on traditional remedies passed down through generations. Despite their compassionate intentions, their efforts were hindered by a lack of medical knowledge and resources. Complications during pregnancy and childbirth often went unattended, leaving enslaved women to face the daunting prospect of giving birth without skilled assistance, heightening the risk of maternal and infant mortality. But that was not the only problem. Nutrition emerged as a pressing concern for pregnant enslaved women, yet their diets fell woefully short. Forced to survive on meager rations provided by their masters, their meals lacked the essential nutrients crucial for a healthy pregnancy. Staple foods like cornmeal, salted pork, and molasses provided calories but were deficient in vital vitamins and minerals, leading to health issues such as anemia and malnutrition. The demanding nature of slave labor only compounded the nutritional hardships faced by pregnant women. Assigned grueling tasks in the fields while enduring meager diets, they suffered from depleted energy levels and increased susceptibility to illness. The combination of strenuous labor and inadequate nutrition created a hostile environment for maternal and fetal health, perpetuating a cycle of deprivation and suffering. The repercussions of insufficient medical care and malnutrition were devastating for pregnant enslaved women and their offspring. Without proper prenatal care, many women experienced preventable complications during pregnancy and childbirth, resulting in alarmingly high rates of maternal and infant mortality. Additionally, nutritional deficiencies during pregnancy heightened the risk of preterm birth, low birth weight, and developmental issues in newborns, perpetuating a cycle of poor health and hardship. Despite facing overwhelming odds, pregnant enslaved women demonstrated remarkable resilience and resourcefulness. They leaned on support networks within their communities, providing solace and assistance to one another in times of need. It's because pregnant enslaved Black women endured a deeply impactful form of oppression that transcended mere physical suffering, profoundly affecting them on emotional and psychological levels. They lived under a constant threat of violence and uncertainty about the fate of their children. This pervasive fear and anxiety arose from the harsh reality that slave owners often prioritized profit over familial ties, callously tearing families apart by forcibly separating parents from their children. The terrible phase would begin during childbirth. Stripped of their fundamental dignity and autonomy, they frequently found themselves giving birth in appalling conditions. Slave quarters, lacking cleanliness and medical resources, served as makeshift delivery rooms where the risk of infection and complications loomed large. After giving birth, the Black newborns were immediately taken and sold. In some cases, the deal to sell them was done during the first weeks of Black women slaves' pregnancies. However, sometimes, the mothers were allowed to take care of their newborns so they could grow and be sold at good prices. But before Black women slaves could understand what really had happened, they were forced to resume their duties, depriving them of essential recovery time. This lack of postpartum rest not only endangered their immediate well-being, but also had enduring effects on their health. The physical toll of childbirth, combined with strenuous labor demands, left many enslaved mothers vulnerable to chronic health issues, perpetuating a cycle of suffering and deprivation. Moreover, the infant mortality rate among enslaved populations was alarmingly high due to factors like malnutrition, limited access to medical care, and harsh living conditions. Many infants did not survive their first year, succumbing to preventable diseases and ailments. This grim reality highlighted the systemic devaluation of Black lives within the institution of slavery, where the lives of enslaved infants were often disregarded. Adding to the challenges faced by enslaved mothers was the practice of wet nursing, where they were often forced to nurse the children of their white owners. This exploitative practice further compromised the health of their own infants, diverting their already scarce resources and energy to care for the offspring of their oppressors. Being compelled to prioritize the needs of white children over their own added yet another layer of trauma to the already burdensome experience of enslaved motherhood. Balancing work demands with child-rearing responsibilities posed a monumental challenge for enslaved women. Many had to bring their infants to the fields where they worked, exposing them to the same harsh conditions that jeopardized their own health. Others had no option but to entrust their children's care to older siblings or elderly enslaved individuals, straining familial bonds and perpetuating intergenerational trauma. The combination of forced labor, inadequate health care, and systemic exploitation created an oppressive environment for enslaved mothers and their infants. Denied even the most basic rights and protections, they endured unimaginable hardships in their struggle for survival. Compounding the anguish was the ever-present fear of sexual abuse and exploitation that enslaved women faced. Regarded as mere property by their white masters and overseers, these women were stripped of their bodily autonomy and subjected to the whims of those in power. This degrading treatment extended to their reproductive rights, with many enduring sexual exploitation during and after pregnancy, exacerbating their trauma and suffering. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. Something should be noted here. White male slave owners chose the specific time of pregnancy to avoid making Black women slaves pregnant with their white children. They could exploit Black female slaves at their will without any fear of explaining later to their wives. It's because Black women slaves' pregnancy acted as a form of birth control, allowing white masters to use Black women slaves for fun and pleasure. For white slave masters, the pregnancies of Black women slaves offered an opportunity to further assert dominance and control over their bodies. Understanding that sexual exploitation during pregnancy wouldn't lead to these women conceiving their own children, masters viewed it as a chance to indulge their darkest desires without concern for unintended consequences. This ruthless manipulation of enslaved Black women's bodies epitomized the power imbalances inherent in slavery, with masters regarding these women as mere objects to be used and discarded at their whim. The aftermath of sexual exploitation during pregnancy brought devastating consequences for enslaved Black women. Enduring relentless physical and emotional abuse, they carried the scars of trauma inflicted by their oppressors. The stress, anxiety, and physical strain endured during pregnancy left them particularly susceptible to complications that could result in miscarriage. The callous disregard for the well-being of enslaved Black women and their unborn children by white masters underscored the cruelty and indifference embedded in the institution of slavery. However, most miscarriages occurred due to sexual exploitation. Despite being pregnant, when Black women slaves were forced to come in sexual encounters, this affected the fetus's health, often leading to miscarriages. Despite the tragic toll of miscarriages on enslaved Black women, slave masters remained indifferent to their suffering. To them, the loss of a pregnancy was inconsequential compared to the sexual satisfaction they achieved. The experience of sexual abuse and exploitation inflicted additional layers of torment on enslaved women, leaving them feeling violated and powerless. The violation of their bodily autonomy intensified feelings of fear, shame, and humiliation, compounding the psychological toll of slavery. For pregnant enslaved women, the trauma of sexual abuse was compounded by the knowledge that their bodies were being exploited to perpetuate the cruel system of slavery, as they were forced to bear children destined for bondage. What's little told is that Black women slaves were priced and sold depending on their ability to get pregnant and ensure hard work despite pregnancy. Black women who bore healthy children and continued working on plantations despite being pregnant were often seen as prized possessions by slave owners. The concept of breeding slaves was a deeply unsettling aspect of the slave economy, where the reproductive capabilities of enslaved women were seen as valuable commodities to be exploited for profit. Slave owners viewed Black women who could bear healthy children as profitable investments, as each child represented potential future labor and increased profits. This dehumanization extended beyond their reproductive capacity to include their ability to work while pregnant and immediately after giving birth. Their ability to endure such hardships while pregnant or immediately after childbirth was seen as evidence of their resilience and strength, qualities highly valued by slave owners. Consequently, women who could bear children and promptly return to work were highly sought after, with their value in the slave market rising with each successful birth. The perverse logic of the slave economy dictated that the more children a Black woman slave could bear, and the quicker she could resume work after childbirth, the higher her price would be on the market. This degrading practice reduced Black women to mere commodities of labor and reproduction, with their value determined solely by their ability to generate profit for their owners. Slave owners actively sought out these productive women and were willing to pay a premium for their services, further perpetuating the exploitation of their bodies and labor. What's more, during periods of high demand for slaves and a scarce market, slave owners employed egregious tactics to bolster their supply of enslaved laborers. To them, Black women who had recently given birth were not regarded as individuals, but rather as valuable assets, prized not only for their reproductive capabilities, but also for their potential to contribute to the growth of the slave population. Therefore, they were made to mate with Black male slaves to give birth to the next child in the least time. The decision to promptly impregnate recently postpartum Black women slaves was solely motivated by the relentless pursuit of profit and the necessity to maintain a consistent influx of enslaved laborers. Slave owners perceived these women not as sentient beings with needs and vulnerabilities, but rather as mere breeding machines, disregarding their physical and emotional well-being in pursuit of financial gain. The absence of any interval between pregnancies starkly underscores the callous and indifferent treatment they endured. The coercion of recently postpartum Black women slaves to mate with robust Black male slaves underscores the systematic dehumanization and exploitation inherent in the institution of slavery. Deprived of agency over their own bodies, these women were subjected to reproductive exploitation solely for the benefit of their owners. The lack of relaxation and time to recover between pregnancies not only jeopardized their health, but also perpetuated cycles of trauma and suffering, intensifying their distress. Furthermore, the forced mating of recently postpartum Black women slaves served to perpetuate slavery across generations. By continuously impregnating these women without consideration for their well-being, slave owners sought to ensure a consistent supply of enslaved laborers for future generations. This ruthless practice inflicted not only physical harm, but also perpetuated the cycle of oppression and exploitation endured by Black women and their descendants. Not only common slave owners, but Thomas Jefferson, one of the nation's founding fathers and its third president, were involved in this inhumane and horrific system. Jefferson was a slave owner who profited from the labor of hundreds of enslaved individuals on his extensive plantations. Among them was Sally Hemings, a Black woman who is believed to have engaged in a sexual relationship with him, resulting in multiple children. This suggests that not only Jefferson had slave breeding farms, but he had picked a Black woman slave for his pleasure. Monticello, Jefferson's plantation situated in Virginia, spanned hundreds of acres and heavily depended on the labor of enslaved individuals. Despite publicly advocating for liberty and equality, Jefferson perpetuated slavery throughout his life, even expanding his holdings through inheritance and acquisition. Enslaved individuals on Jefferson's plantations endured harsh living and working conditions, devoid of autonomy. Sally Hemings was enslaved by him and is speculated to have borne several of his children. While the nature of their relationship is debated, evidence suggests they had a sexual relationship resulting in offspring. Hemings was treated as a concubine, underscoring the power dynamics inherent in the master-slave relationship. Historical records and DNA evidence substantiate the existence of children fathered by Jefferson and Hemings. Born into slavery, these children faced uncertain futures, considered Jefferson's property. While Jefferson granted freedom to some of these children in his will upon reaching adulthood, others remained enslaved or were sold to settle Jefferson's debts after his death. The relationship between Jefferson and Hemings prompts inquiries into consent, power dynamics, and the complexities of racial identity within the context of slavery. Hemings lacked the agency to freely consent to a relationship with Jefferson, given the inherent power disparity. Additionally, any children she bore were viewed as Jefferson's property, further complicating their familial connections. The disclosure that Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, operated a slave breeding farm and was romantically involved with Sally Hemings, a Black slave woman, shines a harsh light on the depths to which certain slave owners descended. This troubling revelation exposes the abhorrent practice of regarding Black slave women merely as objects for sexual gratification, even during pregnancy. Jefferson's actions exemplify how some slave owners viewed enslaved women not only as workers, but also as instruments to fulfill their sexual desires, disregarding their reproductive status. The existence of Jefferson's slave breeding farm underscores the calculated and dehumanizing nature of slavery in America. By establishing such a facility, Jefferson treated enslaved individuals as commodities, solely for the purpose of breeding and increasing his wealth through the sale of their offspring. This callous treatment of enslaved women further perpetuated the systemic exploitation and abuse ingrained in the institution of slavery. Did you learn about this part of Black history in school? What, in your opinion, is the reason they intentionally hide what terrible was done with the enslaved Black women? Is it to avoid guilt? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on whether the white supremacists can get rid of the guilt simply by hiding true Black history. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.